think you are probably, and I've used this way to describe you to other people. You are probably the most well-connected person in this industry. And I have always been impressed about your knowledge of people, but also your ability to connect with people. And I remember at the first time we had spoken before Button 2022, but that was the first time I had met a lot of people in the industry, because obviously it came after COVID and um yeah, so it was the first opportunity to actually meet with a lot of people who I established connections with, and you were one of them. And I remember, bumping into you a few different times during that time, and you would say, "Oh, you have to speak to this person, or you'd have to speak to this person about this particular topic." And it was, these people ranged from being very experienced to, I remember at one point you introduced me to a student, a university student who was there sort of learning and trying to understand, like, is this an industry he wanted to get into? So I've always been very impressed with your ability to connect with people, and it speaks to your, I think, innate curiosity about the industry and what people are doing with content and how content has changed. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your history and how you got to where you are now. You've got two amazing podcasts. You've worked for all these amazing companies. You have a pretty rich portfolio. Give us a little bit about your background and, yeah, what you're doing now.
Well, you just nailed it with the curiosity observation, because it goes back to, I studied journalism in college. And the reason I was a journalism major was that I was going to school on a program that required you to choose a major pretty early on. And I was like, well, I can't do that. So I just went through the course catalog and I found the program that would let me study the most different things. And that was journalism. It also turns out that there's a family history. My mother and aunt were both lifelong journalists. So it wasn't a stretch. It wasn't like, oh my God, accounting or something. So it starts with curiosity. And I think that's where all the human connection comes from. I'm looking at it right now, a postcard a friend sent me back in that same year in college, and I'll read it. It says, in order to discover who you are, first learn who everybody else is, and you're what's left. So I've kind of, ever since then, I've kind of pictured my life as like, if you've ever studied art or drawing, that notion of the white space defining the thing that's in the middle. And so I just start to think of, like I'm the white space in the middle, and everything around me kind of defines my world. And that just leads to like, hey, what are you doing over there? Hey, what are you doing? Who are you? What are you about? And so I think, and then early on in my first career, so just a quick overview of my career. I worked in book publishing right out of college. Journalism, I'm just not suited to daily deadlines, although I can do that and have done that. It wasn't my thing. So I was like, what's good? And then I actually ended up majoring in magazine journalism, thinking that, well, partly because of the format, like, longer form, more detailed kind of stories, and much more about like personality profiles and things like that, which was more to my liking. But then I immediately, right after college, went to a summer program that covered both book and magazine publishing. Went right out of that program into book publishing. Did that for about 10 years, and then the internet came along. And I had been interested in technology that whole time. I got my first computer, I'm old, like in the late 80s. I had my first personal computer and got online. Shortly thereafter, there were services like Prodigy and CompuServe and then AOL when you get into the 90s. And had even before that done like dialing up into Unix accounts, working at the Unix command line to do things like Gopher and Waze searches on the old internet, before the pre-web internet. So I'd always had this kind of technological bent or curiosity again about it. And then the web came along, 93, I think it was when Mosaic was introduced. And I was like, okay, here we go. And I went to my bosses at the publishing companies. And I had a couple of like little sort of denouement moments in that, where one job where they said, okay, if you go out and crush it in this sales role, and we'll give you a job as a field technical expert. And I was like, great. And then I wanted to be on the West Coast, and they offered me a job in New Jersey. And I was like, not so much. And so I was I was ready to move on at that point. But then another company offered me a job as a multimedia marketing manager. I thought, ooh, that's a cool title, and that aligns with my tech interests. It turned out to just be a regular old marketing management job, but it was for like a really cool biology textbook, and like the best-selling book, Campbell's Biology. Probably half your listeners have taken that a course that involves a descendant of that book. But then I was really getting that was 94, 95, 96 that, and the web is blowing up, and I'm reading Byte magazine cover to cover every month and just ready to go. And they're just like, well, hang on there, we got to kill trees and smear ink on them and sell more of these books. And so I kind of 97, I think, when summer of 97, I went to my first internet startup. And then from there, I did kind of internet startup stuff for about 5-6 years up to early 2000s. And was fortunate, the middle one, I had a 3-year stint with a startup called works.com, WORKZ, that was all about internet enablement for small businesses. So I learned everything. We were covering like how to register a domain name, how to do email marketing, how to do SEO, how to write web content, how to, so I was blessed early with just having a good wide swath of web practice. And that sort of evolved into a SEO career for a few years after that, like probably most of the 2000s, I was doing something around SEO. But increasingly over that time, and I forget exactly when Google said it, but they said something about that they were much more interested in human behavior around returning search results than they were about keyword matching. And they're talking about things like pogo sticking and all these behavioral things that they were observing. And I was like, oh, that started an inkling with very quickly. Within a year or two after that, I kind of shifted my identity to UX designer, from first publisher, then sort of SEO marketer, and then UX person. And since then, I've been really focused on how to help people experience web and technology and internet stuff better. And so, mostly in the form of content, and hence, the Content Strategy Insights podcast. And that's almost, 8 years ago now that I started that podcast. Kind of, I've been doing still, even though I had the UX mentality, I was still, in as many public content people do, still involved more with publishing kinds of stuff. But then I was like, I know there's more to this than just publishing stuff, and started talking to everybody, Jared Spool and Jerry McGovern and Sarah Winters and Jeff Eaton, and all the people in the field, trying to flesh out my understanding and comprehension of what content practice was about. And that, I'll tell you, if you want to learn about something, start a podcast and just talk to a couple hundred people. And
yeah, I can definitely identify with that. But I think like what's really interesting about the career you just described, and we'll get into a little bit of detail about that, is this theme of adaptability. So you could have stayed very rigid and said like, no, I'm not leaving book publishing. I'm going to stay in this industry and see it out. And you could have probably done very well. But it's interesting that as the technology has changed and what was important about that technology changed, you were able to change along with it. But not just doing things for the sake of doing things, but seeking out things that you were interested in about the new technology. I think it speaks to a little bit about, the durability of content as an industry, because whatever technology there is, it needs to be filled with stuff, and like no matter what, and whatever form that takes. And it just seems to me that like wherever the stuff is, you've been able to follow and do really well.
That's funny. I had a weird little like lucid dream the other day where I pictured content as this filmy blanket that just lies over everything. Because everything,
Right.
you think about it, and that's the way my content practice has evolved too. My curiosity has extended everywhere from like technical content to product content to marketing to, any kind of content. It always has to do with saying something about what you're doing. So it's like an overlay on any business, any activity, any field, any domain. Yes, it's there. There are things and concepts in it, they're related. And then you can say things about them. And that's what content is. It's kind of trippy, but I think it kind of gets it to what you were just saying. The other thing that gets to what you were just saying, my dad was in the military. So I was raised as a military brat. And that made me I at one point kind of identified almost as a chameleon, Because when you move all
Mm,
the time and you're thrown into new cultures and cities and schools, you just get good at like adapting. And so you use
mm.
the word adaptability. So I think that might be where my adaptability capability came from, was just being dropped into a new school every couple of years.
Yeah, not becoming too precious about, I mean, in the career, in your professional work, I mean, not becoming too precious about, like, attached to your particular method of work, but rather the principles sort of guiding it. And you call yourself a content architect, and on your site you mention a few different practices that you engage with. So there's content architecture, there's content strategy, information architecture, and content design. And you see those things as very, I don't know if I would say very distinct, but you have very clear definitions for them. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly sort of outline what you see as your role in the industry as a content architect. What is that, and what do you do?
Yeah, well, at its simplest, it's just sort of a conflation of content strategy and information architecture. Those are kind of my two core competencies. But the other thing, I had Jesse James Garrett on the podcast a couple of years ago, and we talked about. And I remember well when even before his book, he had done I don't, I can't remember what publication it was, but somebody published his article about the 5 layers of UX practice,
Mm,
and that's one of the other things that led to my transition into UX. And he talks in there about the 5 layers are strategy, scope, skeleton, structure, skeleton, and surface. And and that's always been in my head, just as an organizing scheme for UX practice. And a few years ago, it occurred to me that like content practice aligns really well with that. And in fact, in his one of the versions of his early diagram has like kind of a content half and a UI half, if I recall correctly.
mm,
But anyhow, but I think strategy, tracks obviously content strategy tracks to that base layer in his model. The notion of scope. I think when I think of like how you scope a project, any kind of content or other digital project, is around the domain it's in. So kind of and going from domain to domain modeling, from domain model to a content model. That's sort of a very common activity that I've always done, and it's an integral and important part of any kind of like anything remotely systems oriented, anything bigger than any one product. So I kind of track uh, like my content modeling work to that scope layer. That like
mm,
okay, you kind of have a strategy what you want to do, you know how you want it to look, and the next layer up in the structure, the information architecture part. But how do you figure out what it is and model it so that it's ready to be structured? That's
mm,
what content modeling, and that's sort of the scope part. And then the middle layer, is structure layer, tracks perfectly to information architecture, like how you organize things, label it, both for back end organization of stuff as well as front end navigation, IA kind of stuff. And then there's actually 2 layers above that, the skeleton layer where you assemble stuff. I think of that as content design, because that's really
mm,
a it's analogous to like information design or other fields that have come and gone as in popularity, but it's that place where you assemble the experiences. You assemble, and among the things in that assembly is the content. And so content design is the content part of putting together digital experiences. And then surface, I kind of track to UX writing. I kind of distinguish between content design and UX writing in that sense. Most people do both, and they might have either label. It doesn't really matter. But just in my little pedantic organizing brain, I needed to put them someplace. And I think there is an interesting distinction to be made there about UX writing being analogous to a UI. That like, okay, we've done all this hard work at the content design and information architecture levels about what these things are, how to label them. Now, how are we going to express that in an interface? That's sort of
mm,
how I arrange it. And then I just think of like, it's sort of like, yeah, you're building this little content house. And that's the other origin of the content architecture, which also kind of harkens to, I don't know if you know Stuart Brand's pace layers model. Have you ever seen that?
I
It's,
don't know if it offhand, but
it's
if I
really,
saw
it's
it, I
a,
probably might recognize it.
and I haven't ever really tracked these to that, but it kind of tracks to his how there's 2 metaphors he uses, sort of a geologic model and then sort of a house model. And the house model really resonates in terms of content practice because, like a house, it's got a site where it's located, like the domain it's in that's pretty set. I mean, you can pick up a house and move it, but that's a 1 in a million thing. Then there's the structure of it, the framing, the design, the shape of it, and then you can kind of go all the way in to like the layout of the rooms and the decorations on the wall. There's another analogy to be had there. So anyhow, just a bunch of like things about architecture and content that seem to kind of go together. So that's the origin of the label.
What I find really interesting about this is that just a minute ago, I was talking about your adaptability. Your ability to go from sort of one to have a career over 30 years by sort of focusing on one aspect of a technology and then moving to another and so on. But what you've just described are essentially the same questions that we've been asking since the internet first came online. Now, I was very young in the early 90s. Like, I remember when I was born in 87. So I think we got our first computer when I was 6, and we got online, shortly after that. And I remember, browsing the internet and watching my older brother build websites with, very early sort of markup language and trying to understand like how things were structured and so on. And that was my first familiarity with the idea that things on the internet are built. That there's a layer behind what you're seeing that is actually creating the structure for what is in front of you. And obviously that leads into the practice of information architecture, is what it's called in the late 90s. I'm interested to know, because you've just described yourself being involved in this industry for so long, what do you see as the biggest difference between, say, the types of content we're dealing with now, or the way we deal with content now, and what's similar to it as well? Because again, the same types of questions we were asking back then, we're asking now. How do we structure content? What's changed and what's the same?
It's interesting. I think back, like when I was in journalism school in my early publishing career, you thought of content. I mean, I've actually got a whole list of definitions of content. One of the most demeaning ones is the way media people talk about it. Well, it's the stuff in between the ads, which kind of gets
Right.
an attention
Yeah.
drawing thing. But I think most people would have thought about content in that era as like, the story, a movie or a magazine or a book or a newspaper. There were almost always physical media associated with the content artifact, that came about it. But and there was one of the reasons that I find content so fascinating is that I've watched this kind of disarticulation of content and its presentation over the last 30 years.
Mm.
But back then, it was like, I mean, it was always separate. There's always been I was very attuned early on to the difference between a book manuscript that an author submitted and the final book. The bound thing with all the cover and all the front matter and the index and everything surrounding it. So I was always attuned to that. And I even worked with sort of headless CMSs back in that era using SGML. And so I kind of knew about that there was a difference between content and its presentation. But I think that separation just gets bigger and bigger every year. I think that's one of the key things that's going on. And so it gets more abstract. Like I do a lot of stuff lately with headless, content modeling for headless CMSs. And it's not just a technical, we'll put it in a headless CMS and then we'll serve it up there. There's so much that goes with that. Most publishing systems, or most content management systems to this point, have been more like publishing systems, kind of end to end. The authoring environment permits you to do stuff that looks pretty much like what's going to come out at the other end. There's just a huge amount of like mindset shift that people need to be getting their heads around. The other thing about this, and one of the reasons I think of the benefits of just connecting with so many different people as I do, is that you talk to people in the technical content world and they're like, well, duh, we've been doing that for 25 years, or 20 years,
Right.
Because DITA and the concept of structured, but, really precisely structured content in an XML format that's mapped to how it's displayed and stored in a componentized content management system, which then renders like a PDF or a manual, for a manual or web pages or whatever it's doing. That's just old news to them. So I guess that's another, I don't know, it's not like a trend, but it's like a dynamic that I think because of one of the things that's arising now that gives rise to more connections across these disciplines is the notion of omnichannel content strategy. This notion that I think driven by design principles like customer journey mapping, where your customer doesn't care. When they're in their journey, they just want the content that they need to, to do what they want to do, or learn more about what they're looking at. So it might be on their phone, it might be, on their laptop before they leave for the store, or, there's any number of ways that people might look at it. So that omnichannel strategy need has also driven the need for people to connect. And then you're out there. So I've seen a lot of these conversations the last few years where marketing people have learned from the tech docs people in their org, like, oh, you can structure your content and then reuse it. Cool. And then you see these marketing programs take off.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's a long-winded way of saying that it's the evolution has been like the abstraction of things has created the need to reconnect them in new ways, and we're just kind of starting to figure that out on the fly as we all
Well,
work together.
it's interesting because we were just speaking about this a little before we started recording, but the idea is that we're sort of coming full circle, right? In terms of the required skills we need to make sense of all this content. What the, it's really interesting to me. So in the 90s and through the 2000s, you have built a career on identifying and coordinating and really organizing content, making sure it's structured and able to be used properly in ways that an organization might be able to really benefit from and even profit from, right? And to make sense of all the mess, right? And I think that's even the title of a
That's
book about information architecture,
that's Abby
how to make
Covert's book.
sense of any mess. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're making, you're doing this work, and then, and oftentimes struggling to do it right. And now we reached this point in the late 2010s where the amount of content, I'm using quotes, air quotes here for anyone listening, has now absolutely exploded. And now there's this conversation about AI and generative content and so on. And I think it must drive you nuts at sometimes to see the amount of content that's being poured out and out and out and out and out, and all these generative AI experiences. And I'm sure you're looking at all these going like, guys, wait, like this needs to be structured and organized in order for it to be useful. And of course, I know you speak about this a lot on your podcast, Content and AI. I'm wondering how you're seeing the industry at the minute with all of these generative experiences and what it means for the types of skills you've been talking about that have been around for 25 years, organizing content, information architecture, and so on.
Yeah, to be honest, it's pretty terrifying. It's the hype machine in Silicon Valley is a level I've never seen. Like even I've been binging lately the Internet History podcast and recalling the tech bubble of the late '90s up into the early 2000s, and this is like way surpasses that. And so there's a bunch of implications of that for content people. One, like what you just said, the number of SEOs who just think, oh, good, we can create more content. All I have to do is press a button, enter a prompt, and it'll give me an article. That just is. There's a notion in the machine learning and LLM world of model collapse. That like when a model just starts learning from itself, and then it's just learning gibberish, and so there's a real danger of like just the quality of everything suffering because of that. There's also, but kind of adjacent to that, but not exactly. Anyhow, the search world is changing dramatically. I moderated a panel at the Knowledge Graph conference last month, talking to a bunch of like really top SEO experts, Mike King and Lily Ray and John Shahada and Andrea Volpini, about the implications of AI in search, and in terms of like how it relates to content, like Google quit sending much search. They've kind of just been pushing content per se, other people's content further and further down the page. Most of the search results now are about knowledge panels that they create, and with their own little technology. And now, I guess something like 10 or 15% of U.S. search results are now showing this AI summary at the top of a search page. That just so a huge amount, like especially of the marketing content that's been created the last 20 years has, for very good reason. It's been like, it's sort of how you distinguish yourself as a business. You talk about things adjacent to, maybe about your business per se, but like you demonstrate your expertise around the subject area of it. that kind of content has always been kind of troublesome because everybody wants to be an expert, and there's the ever evolving fight between the search engines and the content creators to hit the threshold of usability and desirability. That just is pretty much thrown out the window at this point. Because of both the proliferation of content, which is going to be poisoning the corpus of materials they have to look at, and the pressure on Google to like do AI stuff. That's like every C-suite in the world right now is just panicking about AI. And
Mm.
the when you look at the results, like that panel I moderated was about what was then called SGE, the Search Generative Experience that Google was experimenting with. They all four of the panelists said it's a piece of crap. They should not launch it. It's going to be bad for them, bad for their users, bad for all publishers, bad for everybody concerned. And then a week later, they rebranded it and launched it, and it's a piece of crap. And there you go. So
Yeah.
it which just kind of points at like the I don't know. I think a lot of that has to do with like we're all going to need to be better at sorting through the hype at every level. Like there's still a huge the thing. That said, I'm being very critical of AI, and everybody should be, but at the same time, it's really helpful and useful in a lot of ways. Like if you're
Mm.
summarizing an article or need a list of things or want to kind of red team your idea for a product and just have a AI agent tear it apart, it's great at that kind of stuff. Um, but at the same time, the those kind of like micro level tactical benefits of it are being incorrectly, I would argue, projected up to a higher level of like, oh great, then we can fire all of our strategists and writers.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you say this because I see it happen a lot with any type of technology where you have the initial technological innovation, right? So generative AI, and then you see what it can do, and then for some reason we automatically think, oh well, in a year it'll be able to do this, right? And you just have to go back and go, hang on, you just made a huge assumption here. You just made a huge assumption that it can get better, that it will get better, that it's cheap to get better. And I think I mentioned this. I don't know who I mentioned this to on this podcast, but I was talking about self-driving cars, right? So 10 years ago, a lot of the discussion in Silicon Valley was about self-driving cars and about how they were only a few years away, and that truck driving jobs were really under threat. Now, self-driving technology is doing some interesting things in San Francisco right now, and there are some services available for that. But no truck driver has been replaced by AI at this point. So I think you're right that there's this leap in our minds that we go to it's almost like catastrophizing about like the end, but it's sort of like the opposite, right? It's like the magical thinking about like what this technology can and therefore will do in the future. But I want to go back to what you were saying. Said you spoke about at the Knowledge Graph conference. Now, this is a term that's been popping up more and more in knowledge graphs. Now, I know it's a very old practice. It's an established practice, but it's gaining more relevance now in this age of generative AI because companies are now trying to figure out and structure the content. Everything we've been talking about in this conversation. Could you just describe, just briefly for people who don't know, what is a knowledge graph and why are they important?
Yeah, knowledge graph is and this is, I'm talking about knowledge graphs in the the sense of the old semantic web. If you ever heard of that Tim Berners-Lee's concept 20 plus years ago about having sort of a data alongside of content on the web, and out of that arose this standard called RDF, the Resource Description Framework, which is just a different way of storing data. We've been trapped in tables for 50 years now, or 60, whenever, like the 70s and the 80s, tabular storage of data became kind of the norm. And all the relational databases, all that, every spreadsheet, of course, is based on that. Like you go to a row, you go to a column, and you go to the cell where the thing is. A graph is a different, an RDF graph is based on these notion of things called triples, which are subject, predicate, object, like Larry knows Patrick. And that can be stored. And then you could say Patrick knows Mario. And then you could say Larry knows people who know Mario. You can do inferences. You can do inferences like that in a relational database. But I learned SQL 25 years ago, and try to forget it every day. But I don't actually, because it's a really useful. It's we have to be able to talk to these machines, and that's one way you can do that. And you can do that in SQL, but it's just unnecessarily cumbersome. So graphs are one. They're just that triple. That notion of the triple, the subject, predicate, object, as the basic unit in there, just permits all kinds of different ways to manipulate and use data. It's super uncommon. It's like maybe 0.01% of databases now are using what's called a triple store. Probably 95% are still in relational databases, and then a lot of the fancy new tech companies use like NoSQL databases and things like that. But a graph database, because of that triple structure, is uniquely capable. You can do way more with it. But that's just like the data layer of that little ecosystem. Above that is like in each of those things can be called an assertion. Like Larry knows Patrick, that's an assertion. That's what they call the A box in the knowledge graph world. Above that is what's called the T box, the term box, the organizing concepts that you use to organize things in those data instances down below. Like you might have people, as an organizing thing, and then Larry and Patrick are both instances of a person in that scheme. So you have like sort of a way of organizing the things in your domain. That layer, the terms in the T box are generated when you design an ontology that describes a domain. And like, so for any one company, you're typically describing like Lyft has a slightly different view of car sharing than Uber. So each company is going to have its own domain way of articulating, like, what's a customer, what's an order, who's a person, all those concepts are articulated and ascribe terms in that T box. A couple of people like Dave McComb and Katrina Kari and others have added an intermediate layer, the C box, the categorization box, which is kind of where taxonomy comes in. It's like how you categorize the things that you have. Like Katerina is the lead ontologist at IKEA, so she's concerned with colors and fabrics and textures and things like that. And so that's sort of in the C box. So you put that all together, this ontological description and understanding of the domain you operate in, how you talk about things, the categorization of it, the individual instances of those things. Those can all be assembled in what they call a knowledge graph. It's sort of the technical implementation, which is done. You can do it. There's a whole bunch of technologies. The original one is called OWL, the Web Ontology Language, which is this sort of space that's really crazy. I struggle every day to get my head around it. It's based on description logic, very precise way to understand the relationships between things in the graph. But there's other things like Shackle and RDFS and different ways. So basically, I'm trying to think of an analogy. Like you can have like the same content displayed in a web app or a web page. You can have the same data set down below and just look at it in different ways depending on the technology choice further up the stack. So I'm getting ready to start a podcast about knowledge graphs. And one of my intents is doing it is to come up with a better description, shorter description, and a better elevator pitch for it. But anyhow, it's a different way of working with data. And content can always be treated as data. So it's relevant to us as content people. Just a different way of dealing with data in ways that are more aligned to the real world. And in fact, the way that fits in with AI, and you've probably heard of RAG, the retrieval augmented generation.
Yep.
So what they're retrieving, it can be any kind of knowledge source. It can be a spreadsheet, it can be a set of documents, but it's often a knowledge graph that informs that workflow, where you're like, hey, this LLM is just making stuff up. It's just predicting things based on vectorized word proximities. Let's give it some better information. So you can improve. And Dean Alamang and Juan Cicada have showed this with a really rigorous experiment that you can improve the reliability of LLM agents with the RAG architecture, and specifically with the knowledge graph, an ontological description of the data you're working with. So it's this really powerful new way of understanding what you got and what to work with, and a little bit going on specifically around content. I've seen recently came across a website that was built entirely from a knowledge graph. Aaron Bradley and I have been putting together a content track at the Knowledge Graph Conference the last few years. with big orgs, mostly media orgs like the BBC and I forget what the one in Germany is called that's like the BBC, Netflix, places like that do a lot with it. So it's the kind of, and among the capabilities it permits is things like recommendation engines, personalization, that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
really
and
yeah.
I was going to say that's why I think it's important for content people to understand, because even though I think for people who aren't so technically inclined, they might have like listened to that and just thought, I have no idea what was just
I
said.
know, and I
But
feel yeah. No, I got to say, I feel horrible about that because there are a whole bunch of aspects of this to which content people are perfectly suited. For example, in one of the books, Ontology Engineering by Deborah McGinnis and Eliza Kendall, there's a whole chapter about organizing stakeholders around terminology. I'm like,
mm,
we do that all the time. We could help you with
yeah,
that, and
yeah.
so there's a. I'm hoping I need to do a better job of talking about this so I can recruit more content people to this world.
Well, I should say like that the reason people, I think, their eyes sort of like sort of going in circles is not because of your description, but because of just the concept itself is just like hard to get around. But I think it's so important for us to know because, as you mentioned, language model output can be improved with the use of knowledge graphs and RAG. But why I think that's important for us to know is because even if content people aren't the ones doing this organizing or creating knowledge graphs or working with them, they will be working with people who are, and they'll be intersecting with people in those teams. In fact, I was just speaking to Ben Barone Nugent, who's worked on Gemini as a content designer. And what he was saying was the teams that start to get organized, there are a content designer working with a conversation designer, working with machine learning expert or an AI expert. And so all three of those people together are working together. And so even some familiarity or some exposure to ideas and concepts and frameworks like knowledge graphs are important for us to know, in the same way that I'm not a coder, but I should still be able to read some JavaScript and vaguely know like what's going on there, like even not every line, not every function, but vaguely be able to sort of recognize it and go, okay, I sort of understand here what's going on. So I don't know if we need to, know everything about knowledge graphs, but the fact that they exist, they're important, and they're a way of organizing data, which can include content, is just a good way for us to think about them, I
Yeah,
think.
and there's actually, it occurs to me, and you might, there's a couple of organizations and consultancies that do a really good job of kind of more conceptually explaining the role. And it's not specifically about knowledge graphs, but just this notion of a semantic layer in
Yeah.
any enterprise tech stack. You have all the data here, you have some kind of semantic understanding of what you got, and then you do applications up here. Both Factor Firm in Seattle, Bram Wessel and Gary Carlson, and the folks at EK Enterprise Knowledge in the DC area, they both have a lot of good information on their websites about that. I think the information layer, the semantic layer, but it's just, and that's where I think content people, like to the extent, and a lot of content strategists and content designers do like a lot of information architecture, and it's sort of at that
Mm.
level. It's just like a new wrinkle on your, and a new tool in your information architecture toolkit, I think, in that sense.
And speaking of information architecture, I mean, we're now at this point where I think you have some really good perspective because you've been able to see the rise of, we were joking a little bit about this before we started recording. Like I was saying like, oh, you've seen a lot of things, and you were joking that like, yeah, I'm old. And I was like, was trying not to say that,
That's
but
true. Yeah.
you have an extensive career history. And so one of the benefits of that is you've been able to see things come, go, shape, and shift. And I have also been around a little while, not as long as some, more than others. But it's interesting to see, like, I've been through a few hype cycles now, and so it's interesting to see things happen. We go like, okay, yeah, I've seen this before. This will go away or whatever. But one thing that stayed the same are a lot of the skills, and a lot of the frameworks and the principles that guide the work. So in your view, for people who are working in content now, what are some of the skills that you think that they should be working on and perfecting and just making sure that they stay sharp on, as opposed to like, oh, I have to learn how to create the greatest prompt in Gemini or GPT or whatever. What are some of the
Yeah.
older sort of tried and tested skills that you think, and based on the conversations you've had with others as well on your podcasts, what are some of the skills that you think people should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I think these foundational skills. Some people kind of call them soft skills. I think soft skills are really hard, so I don't use that term anymore. I think of them as foundational skills, like communication and collaboration. Just getting along with people and understanding people. And in fact, this is emerging as a higher level thing. A lot of like executives and observers in the AI world are talking or predicting a resurgence of interest in the humanities with the arrival of AI, because it's so clear that like it's all tech for tech's sake at this point. And they're like, oh wait, we're human beings and we're selling stuff to human beings. Maybe we should get on top of that. So I think those people skills are going to be essential. And in terms of like specific kinds of collaborative relationships, just getting your head around, even at a basic level, around, but we've all done this over the last 20 years, getting like, what a front end engineer, what a back end engineer does. Like the CMS person is different from the front end designer for your website or your web app or whatever. There's an analogous set. You just alluded to many of the roles, like, just understand at least the basics of what machine learning engineers do, what software engineers do, what the data scientists and data architects are up to. It's just a different set of technical people to interact with. Many of whom, like you, I've talked to some folks. I talked to Laura Constantino at Google. She's been working
Mm,
on Bard on AI products there, and said almost the same thing that you said. That the nature of the team looks very much like the one you described, but also she said that as she gets into it, especially the machine learning folks in particular, are often really taken with the expertise and the knowledge that content people bring to the game, because we're language
mm,
people and these are language models. And so I don't know exactly how that's going to manifest, because a lot of it is like, it's like the math of language. There's the cognitive science of language. There's the content expression of language. There's all these things kind of intersecting. But just to own your expertise around language and figure out how that might apply with your new collaborators, I think that's going to be a powerful thing. I just feel like,
uh,
yeah,
yeah, I think so too. I saw a TikTok the other day that was someone saying that she was complaining, "What am I going to do with my English degree?" And I nearly replied. I was like, "More than you know, because you're
yeah.
desperately needed right now." But we're sort of nearly running out of time here, unfortunately. And we haven't even talked about your wonderful podcasts in depth. So you have two. You
Oh,
have content strategy insights, and you have content and AI. And then you just mentioned the third, which is crazy that you're coming up with a third. I can barely do one and keep up with it. So I gotta say, the conversations you have with people on these podcasts are really great, and you talk to a range of people. So you talk to people at the very front line who are doing the sort of the UX writing and the implementation of text, and then you talk very high up to at the content strategy level. So can you just talk a little bit about your podcasts? What can people expect to find in these, and yeah, a little bit about the knowledge graph one as well.
yeah, there's sort of, so I'm kind of operating in three domains now. The content strategy one goes back almost 8 years now. It's coming up on 8 years of pushing 200 episodes there. Um, that one, it's really weird. I've actually had people, friend pulled me aside at the last confab and said, dude, are you sure you want to stick with content strategies? Like nobody does that or calls it that anymore. And I'm like, nope, sticking with it. I believe in it. And it's kind of related to that content architecture conversation we had earlier. It's content strategy is just like the nice and warm and encompass all encompassing blanket that covers all these various content practices. So the thing that holds it together, I think, is my curiosity, and especially about curiosity
Mm,
about how these things stitch together, but also just genuine curiosity about like, how are you doing that? What are you doing? And I think that a lot of the stuff, even if it's not directly related, like I've had like people like Tom Johnson, like one of the premier technical content guys in the world, and I don't know that a marketing person is going to get anything per se, like day-to-day tips about working from him. But I feel like I hope I'm advancing that kind of cross-disciplinary, cross-content disciplinary conversation around just learning a little bit from each other. So it's pretty wide net. And like you said, I try to go up and down. It's really about practice and sharing practice techniques. Mostly, I really try to stay at the practice level. But if I have the opportunity to talk to like an executive, like I've had a number of executives on lately from like big financial institutions or CEOs of companies, I think all perspectives are relevant, especially for us who are people constantly fighting for a seat at the table. It's like
Mm,
good to understand what those people who assign the tables are thinking about. So the content strategy insights, it's kind of ambitiously broad, but the attempt there is to kind of connect things for folks and to share practice and democratize practice, help everybody get better at it. The content and AI one, to be honest, it's sort of like the same idea, but just specifically around AI. And it's just so topical that with the arrival
mm,
of ChatGPT and the ensuing kerfuffle, it's like, boy, we got to get on top of this because its immediate impact has been, devastating to many people. I think we talked about this earlier about the conflation of the arrival of Gen AI along with the changes in the content design employment market. They're it's like a correlation but not a causation relationship
mm.
there. But anyhow, to sort of address, kind of demystify and democratize what's going on there, like have more conversations like we just talked about, like the folks who are working on these actual big LLMs, like what do those teams look like, how can content people get in there and influence it. I had a great chat with a friend the other day who's leads a big, like 25-person content team at a big financial services company in the DC area, and he was saying that his time lately is spent kind of 50-50 between good old-fashioned content design, where he's still fighting for the seat at the table and doing all the stuff we all have been fretting about. But he said he's also doing the other half of his time is about AI. And he said in that world, the C-suite is calling him, asking for his advice.
Mm.
So this is another, like to the extent that you get interested in it, to follow that interest, cultivate some expertise, and maybe you'll get a call from the chief, from the CEO, asking for your advice. So that's sort of the intent of the content in AI, is to like just again kind of mix it up. I've talked to, I had May Habib, the CEO of Writer.com, on, and
Mm.
to be honest, I was hanging on for dear life trying to follow the technical stuff she was talking about. But then I've had like a business blogger here in the Netherlands on a couple episodes ago, and that was equally fascinating to me to see like a blogger's workflow and using AI, because it's so pervasive and so it's just going to affect everything we do in content.
Yeah.
So that's the Content and AI podcast. It's just very similar intent about democratizing practice and just trying to help everybody know what's going on and do better. The one I'm going to introduce, we were talking earlier, I think before we hit record, about like the Gartner hype cycle, and the Gartners, they have this other thing, they just have all these models. That's what consultants do. They have the impact radar. And the very center of that little bullseye model is knowledge graphs. And that's a community I've been involved with for like 4 or 5 years now, a technology I'm really interested in. I try not to get interested in technology per se, because I'm more interested in practice, but that's one that's really
Mm.
grabbed me. It's a great community, interesting people, an important topic. So I'm going to buy 6 months of my time to do full-time podcasting for the next 6 months. And that's the one I'll add to the mix because it's so timely. And like when we were talking earlier, when I was trying to explain it, I'm like, oh, dude, you got to do better. So let's have a bunch of conversations, talk to people who are better than explaining it, and then maybe we'll get somewhere.
Larry, I gotta say though, I think you do a better job than like the vast majority of people out there. So I think you're a little bit hard on yourself. But look, you've got your two podcasts and a third coming up. Where can people find you online and connect with you?
Best place these days is LinkedIn. I'm just Larry Swanson there. I'm also on, I'm trying to find the new social media places. I'm on Mastodon and Blue Sky, and would love to cultivate conversations in a following there if folks are game. And
Awesome.
Larry Swanson in all those places. Yeah.
Larry, thank you so much for coming on. This has been really great. I always love talking to you. So I think everyone's gained a lot from this conversation. We'll have to talk again in a couple of years and see if all of our predictions come true.
Thank you, Patrick. Likewise, always a pleasure to talk, and I'm excited to see what the next couple of years bring.